Hello, U.S. history students. I'm back with Chapter 9, Section 2 of U.S. history. We're going to be talking about nationalism versus sectionalism. That is harder to say than you think in this section. And I've already written on the board some of the things we're going to be talking about, as well as some details. We'll get to that in a few minutes, but I wanted to go ahead and get it written since it's a lot, so that you don't have to look at the back of my head quite so much. So, we are still struggling with our new national identity, figuring out who we are as a country and what that's going to look like. So, as you will remember in Section 1 of Chapter 9, we talked about some successes that we had in negotiating treaties with foreign powers. And what this did was this gave us as a country a sense of nationalism. Nationalism is your own feelings of pride and loyalty to your country, to a nation. Nationalism can be a very good thing. It can also cause people to do some dumb stuff. When we talk about if we were going to get as far as some of the world wars, you might understand how feelings of nationalism come into play as a negative thing. But for the most part, nationalism is a good thing, and it was in this case. We became a little more unified as a nation, and this idea of nationalism found a strong supporter in a man named Henry Clay. Henry Clay is very important, and he's going to continue to be very important in U.S. government very close to the Civil War. Henry Clay was a senator from Kentucky. He was a gifted speaker. He had a couple of nicknames that he earned. One was the Silver-Tongued Kentuckian. He was incredibly good at arguments and convincing people to see things his way. He became a U.S. Senator by the age of 29, which is really remarkable. He also became known later in his life as the Great Compromiser. Henry Clay was really interested in finding ways for people to work together, specifically North and South. Some historians argue that if it hadn't been for Henry Clay, the U.S. Civil War would have happened much sooner than it did. But Henry Clay was a nationalist. He believed in this country, and he developed something that would be known as the American system. The American system was an economic plan. This was a plan that Henry Clay put forward to make the U.S. economy more self-sufficient. We want to depend less on other countries. We want to be able to produce here what we need here. What you need to know about the American system was that Henry Clay had three main things that he wanted put in place for this to work. The first is a national bank. Now, this is really important because what he wanted to promote with the idea of a national bank was that we would have one currency. And we do, right? If I travel down to Texas to see my family, I don't have to change my Oregon money into Texas money. We all have the same money. And so one of the things that he wanted the national bank to do was to promote an idea of a single currency. This would make interstate trade a lot easier. The second thing he wanted to do was put in place a protective tariff. This tariff would be used as a tax to improve roads and canals, and that's the third part, developing a transportation system. So you can see how they work together. Developing a transportation system that included roads and canals to unite the country. So let's talk about that. Some of those roads and canals. Well, first let's say, I will say that Henry Clay did not have the support of everyone. There were members of Congress who believed that the Constitution did not allow the federal government to spend money on internal improvements. Henry Clay argued against that. He believed that because the gains for the country as a whole would be great, that justified the federal government spending money on things inside the states. Okay, so let's talk about the roads and canals. We're going to actually talk about a couple of specific things. Congress did agree with Henry Clay about the roads. In the early 1800s, the roads in the U.S. were abysmal, if they had any. In fact, this kind of made me laugh the first time I read it. On page 303 in your book, you will see a British actress, Frances Kimball, and she described a road in New York. She had come and was touring with a play, and she described a road that she was on during this visit in the 1830s, and she said, "The wickedest road, I do think, the cruelest, hard-heartedest road that ever a wheel rumbled upon." Our roads here in the U.S. were not in good shape. So, Congress agreed with Clay that we needed to build some roads, and they began to invest money in road building. I want you to look on page 303 in your book. If you don't have your book, you should. Stop me, pause me. It's your chance to get me to stop talking. Pause me, go get your book, come back. Got your book? Okay, great. Turn to page 303. You're going to see a map of the U.S. at the time. And you're going to notice in red are the roads and in blue are the canals. And I want you to see if you can find the Cumberland Road. The Cumberland Road was the very first road ever built by the federal government. It went from the city of Cumberland, Maryland, to Wheeling. Wheeling was a town on the Ohio River in what is now West Virginia. At the time, it was just all Virginia. This, if you look at it, you think, well, that's not very far. Cumberland to Wheeling isn't very far, but I want you to think about what it would take to build a road during this time period. They began construction on the Cumberland Road in 1815, and what they had to do was they had to cut a 66-foot wide band of road. And if you think about it, if you know anything about this section of the U.S. at the time especially, there was a lot of forest, and this is not flat land. So they have to cut 66 feet wide to make this road through forest, and then they had to use shovels and pickaxes. Pickaxes are, if you've seen photographs of like old-timey railroad builders, it's the axe that's got a bar and then it kind of is almost curved. That's a pickaxe. Shovels and pickaxes. They had to dig 12 to 18 inches, so think about a ruler, that's 12 inches, okay? 12 to 18 inches down to make the road bed, and then they would fill that with gravel or crushed stone, and that's how they made a road. They did that without bulldozers, steamrollers, any of the stuff that we use to build a road nowadays. They didn't have any of that. It was all done by hand. They were able to do that in 3 years. So in 3 years, in 1818, the Cumberland Road reached Wheeling. By 1833, the name had changed and it began to be called the National Road, and it stretched all the way to Columbus, Ohio, quite a bit longer. By 1850, the National Road, which started out as the Cumberland Road, reached all the way to Illinois. This was a big deal. It made travel a lot easier, and Americans were interested in that. Many Americans were moving west, and the people that had settled in the West wanted to go back either for trade or to visit. And so we're trying to figure out other ways. One of the other ways that we decided to make transportation easier was by building canals. A canal is basically a man-made river, kind of. You dig a big ditch between one body of water to another body of water. It fills up with water, and you can take boats down it. One of the largest projects was the Erie Canal. The Erie Canal. Construction on the Erie Canal began in 1817, and it was completed in 1825. Again, all by hand. British immigrants, German immigrants, Irish immigrants dug the entire thing by hand with shovels. It cost millions of dollars, but in the end, it was absolutely worth the expense. If you go over to page 306 and 307 in your book, you can see a little bit more about the Erie Canal and about how it worked and how canal locks work and that kind of thing. That might be something fun for Mr. Doomer to explain to you. There's a lot of physics involved in how canal locks work. The Erie Canal, what it did, why it was so important, was it moved stuff and people from New York City to Lake Erie. So all of these little towns between Lake Erie and New York City were able to take advantage of that. It was so successful, in fact, that it became the model for building other canals. And there was, in fact, a boom in the canal building business across the country. And you can see that by looking at the map on 303, how many canals were built. During this time period, there's a very short period of time known as the Era of Good Feelings. The Era of Good Feelings ran from around 1815 to around 1825. So we get 10 years of good feelings, I guess. It was a time of peace. It was a time of pride, national pride, and it was a time of quite a bit of progress. The phrase was actually invented or coined by a Boston editor in 1817 during a visit that James Monroe made to New England. This emphasis on national unity was strengthened by two very important Supreme Court decisions. The first is McCulloch versus Maryland. In McCulloch versus Maryland, the Supreme Court said that the implied powers of Congress allowed for the creation of a national bank. So, okay, when you imply something, that means you don't say it outright, but you say something else that makes everybody understand that this other thing is possible too. And the implied powers of Congress, at least according to the Supreme Court, left Congress with the authority to establish a national bank. There was another court case in 1824 called Gibbons versus Ogden, right here. Gibbons versus Ogden. This one was a big deal because what it said was that states could not interfere with Congress's power to regulate interstate commerce. So, if New York is trading with New Jersey, Congress is allowed to regulate that. Now, we've got this era of good feelings going on, but you know that nothing is perfect, and it wasn't perfect even during this so-called era of good feelings. There were disagreements between different regions. That's known as sectionalism. Disagreements between different regions is known as sectionalism. And these sectional ideas threaten to hurt our union, to hurt our nation. There was a disagreement in 1819 because Congress was considering whether to allow Missouri to enter the Union. And when Missouri entered the Union, would it enter as a slave state or a free state? At the time, the U.S. had 11 free states in the north and 11 slave states in the south. Adding a new slave state would upset that balance of power in the Senate in favor of the South. So, what are we going to do? Well, Congress wanted to protect the power of the free states, so they passed a special amendment. And this amendment declared that the U.S. would accept Missouri as a slave state, but importing enslaved Africans into Missouri would become illegal. This amendment also set the children of Missouri slaves free. Now you can imagine how Southern slave owners felt about this amendment. They were very, very unhappy about it. North Carolina Senator Nathaniel Macon wanted to continue adding slave states. The Senate rejected the amendment. Missouri is still not a state. What are we going to do? In comes our good friend Henry Clay. He is not called the Great Compromiser for nothing. Henry Clay convinced Congress, which is just amazing that anybody could convince Congress of anything, but Henry Clay managed to convince Congress to agree to something called the Missouri Compromise. Now, I've got some things written here. The Missouri Compromise. It was a little more complicated than this, but this is what we're boiling it down to. 3 main conditions. The first, Missouri, MO is Missouri's postal code abbreviation. Missouri will enter the U.S. as a slave state. Okay? Well, that's upset the balance of power. What are we going to do about that? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to enter Maine. ME is Maine's abbreviation. Maine is going to join the Union as a free state. So now we're 12 and 12. Good. But what happens when we add more states? What are we going to do? Well, we're going to do this. We're going to divide the Union north and south. Slavery is prohibited in new states that are added above the 3630 parallel. So if you're looking at a map and you see the lines that go up and down on a map and the lines that go across on the map, you probably already know this, but let's just do a little refresher. The ones that go up and down are longitude. The ones that go across are latitude. Any state that joined the Union that was north of the 3630 latitude line was going to join as a free state. And then any state that was under 3630 latitude would join as a slave state. This compromise was successful, but there were still a lot of disagreements between the North and the South over the expansion of slavery, and that's only going to get worse and worse and worse as we draw closer to the Civil War. One other issue that we have is the election of 1824. We've got some controversy here. Andrew Jackson won the most popular votes in 1824, but he did not have enough electoral votes to win office. Now you will remember that the Electoral College really decides who's going to be president. Under the Constitution, the House of Representatives had to choose the winner. The House chose John Quincy Adams. We talked about him in our last section, in section 1, John Quincy Adams. And he was, what was he? Number 6, president number 6. They chose John Quincy Adams, and Andrew Jackson's supporters were very angry about this. They claimed that John Quincy Adams had made a corrupt bargain with Henry Clay. When J.Q. Adams, who was the son of our second president, John Adams, when John Quincy Adams became president, he chose Henry Clay to be his Secretary of State. And whether or not he had made a deal with Henry Clay prior to that, it certainly looked bad. And it ended up weakening a lot of John Quincy Adams's support in this, during his presidency. And that's going to come back to bite him later on. That's it for section 2. In our next section, we're actually going to turn a little bit away from kind of what we've been studying about history, and we're going to talk about American culture of the time, because it was during this time period that American culture as a separate and individual and unique thing really began to flourish, and that's going to be a lot of fun. So stay tuned, and we'll talk about that tomorrow.